March 15th, 1944. The small village of Saint-Laurent, nestled in the Loire Valley of France, awakened to a crisp morning mist that shrouded the rolling vineyards in a ghostly veil. In the modest stone cottage at the edge of town, Corporal Werner Kleinschmidt of the German army believed he had finally found a safe haven from the war that had stolen his faith and nearly his life. He could not have known that his desperate gambit for survival would soon plunge him into the most dangerous game of deception in occupied France. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the tale of how one man's attempt to escape the machinery of war led him directly into its secret heart, forever changing his understanding of courage, loyalty, and the human capacity for resistance in the face of overwhelming odds. In the early spring of 1944, the tide of the European conflict had begun to turn decisively against the German forces. The once unstoppable German war machine that had conquered most of continental Europe was now showing signs of strain. Production figures from German factories had fallen by 20% since 1942, while American industrial output had increased by 130% in the same period. These were not merely abstract numbers to Werner Kleinschmidt, but the concrete reality he had witnessed firsthand as supply shortages became increasingly common at the front. Werner had not begun the war as a deserter. He had been drafted in 1941 at the age of 23, leaving behind his studies in engineering at the Technical University of Dresden. His technical aptitude had earned him a position in the Communications Division of the 212th Infantry Regiment, where he maintained radio equipment rather than firing weapons on the front lines. This relative safety had allowed him a unique vantage point from which to observe the gradual deterioration of German military advantage. "The winter of 43 was when I knew it was over for us," Werner later wrote in a personal account discovered after the war. "We received orders to conserve fuel by shutting down radio communications for 16 hours each day. Meanwhile, we intercepted American transmissions that never ceased. They had no shortages, no rationing. Their voices filled our airwaves even when we were forced into silence." By February 1944, Werner's regiment had been relocated from the Eastern Front to occupied France, specifically to the Loire Valley region, where they were tasked with monitoring resistance activities and maintaining order in the increasingly restive countryside. The reassignment had come as a relief to Werner, who had witnessed the brutal conditions on the Russian front and feared an eventual return to that frozen hell. "France seemed like a paradise after Russia," he noted. "The people walked with their eyes downcast, but their homes remained intact. Their children still played in the streets. There was still wine in their cellars and sometimes bread on their tables. It was a different kind of occupation, one where we could almost pretend we were not hated." This illusion was shattered for Werner on the night of March 10th, when he witnessed the execution of 3 French civilians accused of harboring resistance fighters. The senior officer in charge, Major Dieter Hoffmann, had ordered the entire company to witness the punishment. "This is the price of treason," Major Hoffmann announced to the assembled villagers in the town square of Saint-Laurent. "The German Reich extends its hand in friendship to those who cooperate and its fist to those who resist." Werner stood in formation with his comrades, his face carefully arranged in the expressionless mask that had become second nature to all soldiers who wished to survive. Yet inside, something fundamental had shifted. The engineering student from Dresden, who had once believed in the ordered rationality of the world, could no longer reconcile himself to the system in which he had become embedded. That night, Werner did not return to his barracks after his evening patrol. He removed his identification tags, buried his sidearm in the soft earth near the river, and slipped away into the darkness of the French countryside with nothing but his uniform, a small amount of French currency he had saved, and the technical knowledge in his head. For 4 days he moved only at night, avoiding roads and sleeping in abandoned farm buildings during daylight hours. He subsisted on early spring vegetables taken from fields and whatever he could scavenge without being noticed. His uniform became a liability, so he deliberately smeared it with mud and tore the insignia from the fabric. From a distance, he hoped to be mistaken for a French farmhand rather than a German soldier. His plan, such as it was, extended no further than reaching the coastal region near Nantes, where he had heard rumors of fishing boats that smuggled escaped prisoners of war to neutral Spain for a price. He had enough money for such a passage, if the rumors were true, but first he had to traverse more than 200 kilometers of occupied territory without being captured. On the 5th day of his journey, exhaustion and hunger forced Werner to take a risk. He approached a small cottage set apart from the nearest village, hoping to barter his remaining valuables, a silver pocket watch and a fountain pen, for food and perhaps a place to rest for a few hours. The cottage belonged to Elise Beaumont, a 32-year-old widow whose husband, Armand, had been killed in the early days of the German invasion in 1940. She lived alone, tending to a small plot of land that provided vegetables, maintaining a few chickens for eggs, and working part-time at the village bakery to earn enough money to pay her taxes. I knew the moment I saw her that my fate was in her hands, Werner recalled later. She stood in the doorway with a wooden spoon in one hand, and a look in her eyes that told me she recognized exactly what I was, no matter how I had tried to disguise it. Elise Beaumont was slender but strong, with dark hair typically tied back in a practical knot and hands roughened by daily labor. Her face might have been beautiful in peacetime, but 4 years of occupation had etched lines of worry around her eyes and mouth. Still, there was something in her direct gaze that spoke of an unbroken spirit. "German," she said simply, when Werner approached her door, speaking the word not as a question, but as an identification. Werner did not attempt to deny it. His French was passable but heavily accented. "I have left that behind," he replied in careful French. "I'm alone and hungry, I can pay." He held out the silver watch, its surface catching the late afternoon sunlight. Elise did not look at the offered payment. Instead, she studied his face with an intensity that made him acutely uncomfortable. "Why should I help you?" she asked. "Your people took my husband, your people take our food, your people shoot our neighbors. I cannot change what others have done," Werner answered, the desperation making him more eloquent in his adopted language than he might otherwise have been. "I can only choose what I do now, and I have chosen to no longer be part of their army." A long silence followed his words. In the distance, a church bell tolled the hour. 6 chimes. Evening was approaching, and with it the increased patrols that made travel after curfew a virtual death sentence. "Come inside," Elise said finally, stepping back from the doorway. "If they find you here, they will kill us both. So you understand what I risk." That first evening established a pattern that would continue for the next 2 days. Werner slept in the small cellar beneath the kitchen, a space barely large enough for a grown man to stretch out, while Elise continued her normal routines above. She brought him food and water at irregular intervals and empty bottles for his bodily needs, which he would clean himself. They spoke little, their interactions limited by language barriers and mutual caution. On the second day, Elise returned from the village with news that chilled Werner's blood. "They are searching for you," she reported. "House by house, farm by farm. They say you have stolen important military documents. They say you are a traitor who must be caught before you can reach enemy agents." Werner shook his head vehemently. "I took nothing. I only wanted to escape." "It does not matter what is true," Elise replied with the weariness of someone who had lived under occupation for 4 years. "What matters is that they will not stop looking, and when they come here, and they will come here eventually, they will search thoroughly." "I will leave tonight," Werner offered immediately. "You have done enough." "And be captured before you reach the end of the valley?" Elise shook her head. "No. I have another idea, but you may find it distasteful." The idea, when she explained it, seemed both brilliant and terrifying in its audacity. The German authorities had established a system whereby French citizens must register any change in household composition, births, deaths, and marriages, with both the local mayor and the German administrative office. A recently married woman might reasonably have a man living in her home without arousing immediate suspicion, especially if the marriage had been properly registered. "You want us to pretend to be married?" Werner asked incredulously. "I want us to be married," Elise corrected. "Legally, on paper. Mayor Thibault knows me since childhood. He will perform the ceremony without asking too many questions if I tell him it is necessary. I will say you are a distant cousin of my late husband, a widower from Alsace, who speaks German because of the border region. Your accent will seem natural then. But why would you do this? Werner could not comprehend the magnitude of the risk she proposed taking. Elise's eyes took on a faraway look. Because every act of deception against them honors my husband's memory. Because helping you escape is one small victory in a war where we have seen too many defeats. The simplicity and conviction of her answer silenced any further questions from Werner. The next morning, Elise went alone to speak with Mayor Thibault. She returned 3 hours later with news that the mayor had agreed to perform a small private ceremony that very afternoon. She also brought civilian clothes for Werner, simple trousers, a worn shirt, and a cap that had belonged to her late husband. These might be slightly small for you, she apologized, but better than what you are wearing now. The ceremony itself was brief and surreal. Mayor Thibault, a portly man in his 60s with a magnificent white mustache, asked few questions beyond those required by law. 2 elderly neighbors served as witnesses, their roomy eyes registering curiosity but not suspicion at the hasty marriage. Werner signed the register with the name he and Elise had agreed upon, Pierre Beaumont, returning to reclaim his cousin's widow after losing his own wife to illness. Your papers will be processed and ready within 2 days, the mayor informed them as he stamped the wedding certificate. Until then, this document should satisfy any inquiries. As they walked back to Elise's cottage, now their cottage, according to French law and German occupation regulations, Werner felt a curious mixture of relief and heightened tension. He had gained a measure of legitimacy, but also a new set of complications. He was no longer simply hiding. He was now actively participating in an elaborate deception. We should behave as a normal married couple would, Elise advised, as they approached the cottage. Neighbors talk, patrols observe. We cannot give them reason to look too closely. And so began the strange charade. During the day, Werner helped with tasks around the small property, chopping wood, repairing a section of fence that had collapsed during winter storms, tending to the vegetable garden. These activities were visible from the road, establishing the presence of the new husband in a way that seemed natural. In the evenings, they sat together by the fire, sometimes talking in low voices, sometimes simply existing in a companionable silence that required no performance. Werner learned that Elise had been a schoolteacher before the war, specializing in literature and history. She spoke of her late husband, Armand, with quiet reverence, a carpenter by trade who had volunteered for military service in the first days of the conflict and died during the retreat to Dunkirk without ever knowing he would become a father. A father? Werner asked, startled by this revelation. Elise nodded, her eyes focused on the middle distance. I was 2 months pregnant when he left. I lost the baby in my 5th month. The doctor said it was the stress and grief. She spoke matter-of-factly, without visible emotion, but Werner noticed how her hands twisted the fabric of her apron as she shared this part of her story. In turn, Werner told her of his life in Dresden, his widowed mother who still believed her son was serving honorably, his interrupted studies and his hope to someday return to them. He described the gradual process by which his faith in the German cause had eroded, not in a single moment of revelation, but through countless small observations that accumulated like snowflakes until they created an avalanche of doubt. I was never a true believer in the ideologies, he admitted. I simply wanted to study, to build things rather than destroy them. The war seemed distant until suddenly I was part of it. On the 3rd night after their hasty wedding, as they prepared for sleep, Werner on a pallet near the fire, Elise in the small bedroom, a sharp knock at the door froze them both in place. It was well past curfew, nearly 2300 hours. No neighbor would risk visiting at such a time. Elise recovered first, motioning for Werner to remain calm. Let me handle this, she whispered, smoothing her hair and pinching her cheeks to bring color to them before approaching the door. The visitor was Lieutenant Klaus Brauer, a young officer whom Werner recognized immediately, although they had never directly interacted during his time with the regiment. Werner kept his head slightly turned away, affecting the posture of a civilian annoyed by military interruption rather than a deserter terrified of discovery. Good evening, madame, Lieutenant Brouwer said in accented but fluent French. "I apologize for the late hour, but we are conducting security checks throughout the region. My husband and I were preparing for bed," Elise replied, her tone perfectly balanced between politeness and irritation. "What sort of security concerns bring you to our door at this hour?" "Routine matters," the lieutenant answered vaguely. "May I come in for a moment? Just a few questions." Werner's heart pounded so loudly in his chest that he felt certain the German officer must hear it. Nevertheless, he nodded a grudging welcome, playing the role of the inconvenienced civilian husband. Lieutenant Brouwer stepped inside, his eyes sweeping the modest interior of the cottage. "You are newly married, I understand. The records at the Kommandantur show a recent registration." 3 days ago, Elise confirmed, moving to stand beside Werner in a gesture that appeared both protective and natural. "My husband has come from Alsace to join me after losing his first wife last winter." The lieutenant's gaze fixed on Werner. "Alsace," he repeated thoughtfully. "Then you speak German, monsieur?" Werner cleared his throat, acutely aware that his French accent might not withstand scrutiny by a native German speaker, while his natural German might be recognized as sharing regional characteristics with his true identity. He chose a middle path. "Ja," he replied, deliberately thickening his accent to suggest someone who had learned German as a second language in a border region, enough for trade, not for poetry. Lieutenant Brouwer smiled thinly. "We need no poets in these difficult times, only honest citizens." He continued in German, asking several mundane questions about Werner's fictional background in Alsace. Werner responded carefully, maintaining his deliberately imperfect grammar and pronunciation while providing the details he and Elise had rehearsed. His work as a carpenter, like Elise's first husband. His fictional first wife, taken by pneumonia during the previous winter. His journey to the Loire Valley to seek out his cousin's widow, whom he had met once before the war. The lieutenant listened impassively, occasionally glancing around the cottage as if expecting to find evidence of some transgression. Finally, he switched back to French. "One last question, madame," he said, addressing Elise directly. "We have reports of unusual activity in this area. Strangers moving at night, supplies disappearing. You have noticed nothing unusual?" "Only the usual hardships of occupation," Elise replied evenly. "Less food each year, more restrictions, more searches in the night." The slight emphasis she placed on the last words caused the lieutenant to stiffen momentarily before inclining his head in acknowledgement. "Your cooperation is noted and appreciated," he said formally. "Good night to you both." After the lieutenant departed, neither Werner nor Elise spoke for several long minutes, listening to the receding footsteps and then the distant sound of a vehicle engine starting. When they finally looked at each other, Werner saw in Elise's eyes the same mixture of terror and exhilaration that coursed through his own veins. "He suspected something," Werner said quietly. "They always suspect something," Elise replied. "It is the nature of occupation. But suspicion is not the same as knowledge." That night, Werner slept fitfully, his dreams populated by pursuing figures in familiar uniforms. He awoke before dawn, his body tense with the certainty that they had not seen the last of Lieutenant Brouwer. As he moved through the cottage in the grey pre-morning light, he became aware of a sound he had not noticed before. A faint, rhythmic creaking that seemed to come from beneath the kitchen floor. Elise emerged from her bedroom, her expression confirming that she too heard the noise. Without speaking, she moved to the kitchen and shifted a small rug to reveal a trap-door Werner had not known existed. It was cleverly constructed, its edges disguised to match the surrounding floorboards perfectly when closed. "The cellar where you first hid is not the only space beneath this cottage," Elise explained in a whisper. "My husband built a larger chamber below before he left for war. He said it might be needed if things went badly." She lifted the trap-door, revealing a steep set of stairs descending into darkness. The creaking sound grew slightly louder with the opening. Werner followed her down the narrow steps, ducking his head beneath the low ceiling. The space below was larger than he had expected, perhaps 4 meters by 3, with a ceiling just high enough for him to stand upright in the center. The dim light from above revealed the source of the creaking sound. A man lay on a narrow cot against the far wall, his leg encased in a crude splint, moving restlessly in his sleep. Near him, another figure sat upright, instantly alert at their entrance. "It is all right," Elise said softly in English. "This is Pierre. He is helping us." The seated man relaxed slightly, but kept his eyes fixed on Werner with undisguised suspicion. He was young, perhaps 25, with close-cropped light brown hair and the lean, hard physique of a trained soldier. When he spoke, his accent was unmistakably American. "That was a German patrol last night," he said, not a question but a statement. "We heard them through the floor." "Just one officer," Elise confirmed. "He has gone for now, but they are increasing their searches." Werner stood frozen in place, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were telling him. The injured man on the cot wore no uniform, but the healthy one beside him had the unmistakable bearing of military personnel. American military, based on his accent and appearance. "You are harboring Allied airmen," Werner said slowly, the realization dawning with a terrible clarity. "That is why you took the risk of hiding me of the false marriage. You already had much more dangerous secrets." Elise's gaze was steady, neither confirming nor denying his conclusion. "You should meet everyone," she said instead, turning to illuminate the full space with the small lamp she carried. What Werner saw next nearly stopped his heart. The basement was not occupied by 1 or 2 men, as he had first thought, but by 10. 10 American airmen in various states of health, some sleeping on pallets arranged around the perimeter of the room, others sitting against the walls watching him with the wary eyes of men who had already survived being shot down over enemy territory. One man near the back of the room stood as Werner's gaze fell upon him. Unlike the others, he wore parts of what was clearly an American officer's uniform, though the insignia had been removed. "Captain James Miller, United States Army Air Forces, 447th Bombardment Group." He introduced himself quietly. "And you, I take it, are not actually a Frenchman named Pierre." Werner felt the ground shifting beneath him. He had deserted the German army to escape the war, only to find himself standing in the midst of it in its most dangerous form. Under German military law, sheltering enemy airmen was punishable by immediate execution. Not just for those providing the shelter, but for entire communities suspected of complicity. "No," he admitted, seeing no point in maintaining the deception. "I am Werner Kleinschmidt, former corporal, German Army, now a deserter with a price on his head." He paused, then added with a bitter laugh, "and apparently now the husband of the most courageous woman in occupied France." Captain Miller's expression revealed nothing of his thoughts. "A German deserter married to our French contact. That's a new one, even for this war." He glanced at Elise. "You trust him?" "I trusted him enough to make him my husband in the eyes of the law," Elise replied with a slight shrug, though admittedly, the circumstances were unusual. "That's putting it mildly," one of the other Americans muttered. Werner found himself at a crossroads he had never anticipated. His plan had been simple: escape, reach the coast, find passage to neutral territory, survive the war. Now he stood in a basement filled with enemy combatants, legally bound to a woman who was clearly a key figure in the French resistance, with German patrols intensifying their searches in the immediate vicinity. "What happens now?" he asked, directing the question at no one in particular. Captain Miller exchanged glances with Elise before answering. "That depends on you, Corporal. Or should I say, Monsieur Beaumont. You have 3 choices, as I see it. You can turn us in and hope for clemency from your former comrades. You can leave and take your chances alone, as you originally planned. Or you can help us and perhaps find a different path to safety than the one you imagined." Werner looked around the basement at the faces watching him, American, French, and in the small mirror hanging on the wall near the stairs, his own Germanic features. 3 nations brought together in this hidden space beneath a French cottage, connected by danger and necessity, rather than friendship. "I did not desert to change sides," he said slowly. "I deserted because I could no longer be part of what Germany has become. I wanted no more part in this war." "The war found you anyway," Captain Miller observed. "It has a habit of doing that." Elise stepped forward, her face illuminated in the dim lamplight of the basement. "No one is asking you to change sides, Werner," she said softly. "But we are all caught in this current together now. If one of us drowns, we all do." Werner looked at her, struck by the simple truth of her words. He had crossed a line when he deserted, and another when he agreed to the marriage of convenience. There was no going back, only forward through whatever complications lay ahead. "What exactly do you need from me?" he asked, addressing Captain Miller, but glancing at Elise. "Information, primarily," Miller replied. "You were communications, correct? You know frequencies, protocols, patrol schedules, things that could help us coordinate an extraction for these men." Werner nodded slowly. The request seemed reasonable, a way to help without directly taking up arms against his former comrades. "I can provide that, though my information is already several days old. Protocols may have changed since my departure was discovered." "Even outdated intelligence is better than none," one of the other Americans commented. He was older than most of the others, with grey threading through his dark hair at the temples. "Lieutenant Thomas Parker, navigator," he introduced himself with a slight nod. "We've been stuck here for 2 weeks, with no way to make contact with our people." Werner learned that the Americans were the combined crews of 2 B-17 Flying Fortresses, shot down during a bombing raid on German rail infrastructure near Tours. Their aircraft had been part of a formation of 24 bombers that encountered unexpectedly heavy anti-aircraft fire. Most had escaped, but these 2 crews had been forced to bail out over occupied territory. "The local resistance found us scattered across 15 kilometers, Captain Miller explained. "They brought us together and eventually to Elise. She's been hiding us while we wait for extraction." "My contact in the network was supposed to return 5 days ago," Elise added. "Something must have gone wrong. We have food for perhaps another week, but the injured need medical attention we cannot provide here." Werner's gaze shifted to the man with the splintered leg, who he now noticed was sweating profusely despite the coolness of the basement. "Infection?" he asked. Miller nodded grimly. "Compound fracture during the landing. We set it as best we could, but Sergeant Reynolds needs antibiotics and proper surgical care. And now the German patrols are increasing," Werner murmured thoughtfully. "Because of me, or was this happening already?" "Both." "Perhaps," Elise suggested. "There have been reports of increased resistance activity throughout the region. The Germans always respond with heightened security. Your disappearance likely added urgency to existing plans." Werner found himself thinking like the communications specialist he had been trained to be, analyzing problems and seeking solutions based on available resources. "The officer who visited last night, Lieutenant Brower, is young and ambitious. He will return, probably with reinforcements. This house will be searched thoroughly, perhaps as soon as today." "The entrance is well concealed," Elise pointed out. "My husband built it to withstand scrutiny. No hiding place withstands dedicated search parties with time and motivation," Werner countered. "We need to move these men before that happens." The word "we" hung in the air, marking a subtle but significant shift in Werner's position. No longer merely a fugitive seeking personal safety, he had aligned himself with their precarious collective. Captain Miller seemed to notice the change as well. "You have a suggestion?" Werner considered for a moment before responding. "The German headquarters maintains 3 radio channels for routine communications. I know the frequencies and encryption protocols. If we could access a transmitter powerful enough, we might be able to monitor their communications and perhaps even send false information to create a diversion." "There's a transmitter at Monsieur Laval's farm," Elise said, "part of the resistance network. But it's 8 kilometers from here, and moving 10 American airmen across open country in daylight is impossible." "Not all at once," Werner agreed. "But what about moving them in small groups, disguised as French agricultural workers? I noticed several farms between here and the next village, with spring planting underway. Extra workers would not seem unusual." The discussion continued in hushed tones as the plan took shape. They would move the Americans in pairs, with the most seriously injured, Sergeant Reynolds, going first to receive medical attention. Each pair would be disguised as French workers and escorted by either Elise or Werner to avoid arousing suspicion if they were stopped and questioned. As the others debated details, Werner found himself drawn to a corner of the basement where a slender young American sat slightly apart from the group. Unlike his comrades, he seemed to be deliberately avoiding participation in the planning session. "You disagree with the plan?" Werner asked quietly, sitting down beside him. The young man glanced up, surprise flickering across his features before his expression hardened again. "I don't disagree with the plan. I disagree with trusting a German with our lives," and he replied candidly. Werner nodded, accepting the suspicion as reasonable. "I understand. In your position, I might feel the same." "Would you?" The American's tone was skeptical. "My brother was on a bomber that never came back from Berlin 3 months ago. 83 men from our base didn't return that night, so you'll forgive me if I find it hard to believe your sudden conversion." "I have not converted to anything," Werner replied honestly. "I simply reached a point where I could no longer participate in something I believed was wrong. That doesn't make me your ally necessarily. It just means we currently share a problem." The young man studied him for a long moment before offering his hand. "Lieutenant David Cohen, flight engineer." Werner Kleinschmidt, former communications specialist, current deserter and reluctant husband. A ghost of a smile crossed Cohen's face. "That's quite a career change in 1 week." Before Werner could respond, their attention was drawn to a subtle signal from Elise, 3 quick taps on the wooden support beam near the stairs. The basement fell immediately silent. Someone extinguished the lamp, plunging them into darkness, broken only by thin slivers of light from between the floorboards above. Footsteps moved across the kitchen floor overhead. More than one set, male voices speaking German. Werner recognized Lieutenant Brauer's clipped tones immediately, followed by the deeper voice of someone with more authority, perhaps Captain Richter, the regional security commander. Elise's voice joined the conversation, her tone polite but firm as she questioned the reason for their visit. The German responses were muffled but clearly insistent. The footsteps spread out, moving from the kitchen to other parts of the small cottage. They were conducting a search, just as Werner had predicted. In the darkness of the basement, Werner felt a hand grip his arm. Lieutenant Cohen, he realized. The young American was trembling slightly. Whether from fear or the effort of remaining silent, Werner couldn't tell. Above them, furniture was being moved. Cupboards opened and closed. Heavy footsteps circled directly overhead, pausing occasionally as if the searcher were listening or examining something closely. At one point, a heavy object, perhaps a boot, struck the floor directly above the hidden trapdoor, causing tiny particles of dust to filter down through the cracks between the boards. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, though Werner's internal clock told him the search lasted approximately 20 minutes. Finally, the footsteps converged again in the kitchen. More conversation, still muffled but with a different tone now, less aggressive, more formal. The front door opened and closed. Footsteps receded. Still, no one in the basement moved or spoke. They had all been in hiding long enough to know that apparent departures could be tricks, designed to lure the unwary into revealing themselves. It was only when Elise's specific all-clear signal, 5 measured taps on the support beam, came that the tension in the basement eased slightly. The trapdoor opened, sending a shaft of daylight into the space below. Elise's face appeared in the opening. "They have gone for now," she reported, "but they will return tomorrow with written authorization to conduct a more thorough search." The captain was apologetic, but insistent. "They are looking for a network, not just a single deserter." Werner climbed the stairs to join her in the kitchen. "Then we have less than 24 hours to implement our plan." Elise nodded grimly. "I will go to Laval's farm immediately to arrange for the transmitter and medical supplies for Sergeant Reynolds. You should prepare the first group for movement." As she gathered her shawl and basket, props for her role as a housewife on ordinary errands, Werner caught her hand. "Be careful," he said, surprising himself with the genuine concern behind the words. "If they are watching the house, they may follow you." "I have been doing this for 3 years," she reminded him with a faint smile. "I know how to lose a tail." After she departed, Werner returned to the basement to help prepare the first group for transport. Sergeant Reynolds would go with Lieutenant Parker, the oldest and most level-headed of the Americans. They would pose as uncle and injured nephew, traveling to seek medical attention from a doctor in the next village. Actually a resistance contact, who could treat the infected leg and provide a safer hiding place. "I need to clean you up first," Werner told the Americans. "Your hands are too soft, your face is too clean. No one will believe you are farm workers." Using dirt from the garden mixed with a small amount of cooking oil, Werner created a convincing grime that he applied to their faces, necks, and hands. He showed them how to assume the slightly stooped posture of men who had spent decades working the land and coached them on common French phrases they might need if questioned. "Remember, you are not trying to convince them you are French," he explained. "The Germans know there are many rural people who speak little besides their local dialect. Your job is simply not to stand out as obviously foreign." Lieutenant Parker, who had some facility with languages, practiced the few French phrases Werner taught him. Sergeant Reynolds, feverish and weak, would play the role of a mute, injured relative, a convenient cover for his inability to speak the language and his actual physical condition. As Werner worked, he found himself drawing on memories of his university theatre group, where he had occasionally participated in productions before the war. The skills he had learned there, makeup application, costume design, character development, now served a deadly serious purpose, far from the light-hearted student performances of his past. By mid-afternoon, Elise had returned with news that Monsieur Laval was expecting them and had medical supplies ready. She had also brought rough peasant clothing for the disguises. Worn trousers, patched shirts, and caps pulled low over the eyes would help conceal the Americans' foreign features. "We should go in separate directions," Werner suggested as they finalized the plan. "You take Parker and Reynolds toward Laval's farm. I will prepare the next group and lead them by the river path when darkness falls." Captain Miller, who would remain with the larger group until the final evacuation, nodded his agreement with the strategy. "Lieutenant Cohen and Sergeant Wilson will go next. They both have some French language ability." Werner glanced at Cohen, noting the lieutenant's obvious discomfort at being selected to accompany the German deserter. "Is that acceptable to you, Lieutenant?" he asked directly. Cohen's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly. "I follow my captain's orders." The first transfer proceeded more smoothly than any of them had dared hope. Elise departed with Parker, supporting the limping Reynolds, their departure timed to coincide with the normal afternoon movements of local farmers returning from fieldwork. Werner watched from the window until they disappeared around the bend in the road, then turned his attention to preparing the second group. As evening approached, Werner worked with Cohen and Wilson on their disguises and cover story, cousins returning from checking irrigation channels along the river. The backstory was simple enough to be maintained under questioning, but detailed enough to seem authentic. "You grew up in the stone house near the old mill," Werner instructed them. "Your father cultivates carrots and turnips in the north field. Your mother makes the best apple tarts in the village. Simple details that anyone local would know." Cohen absorbed the information with intense concentration. "How do you know so much about creating false identities?" he asked during a pause in the instruction. Werner smiled wryly. "When you spend years in an army where questioning orders is dangerous, you become very good at appearing to be exactly what others expect, while keeping your true thoughts hidden. It is not so different from what we do now, only the audience has changed." As dusk settled over the countryside, Werner led Cohen and Wilson up from the basement. They wore the rough clothes Elise had provided, with caps pulled low and days of genuine stubble on their faces, adding to their disguise. Both carried simple farm tools, a hoe and a pruning knife, as props and potential weapons if needed. "We follow the river path for 2 kilometers, Werner reminded them in a whisper, "then cross at the shallow ford to approach Laval's farm from the east. If we are challenged, I do the talking. You appear slow-witted and defer to me." They slipped out through the garden at the rear of the cottage, using the gathering darkness and scattered trees for cover until they reached the narrow path that ran alongside the river. Here they moved more openly but remained vigilant, Werner setting a pace that matched that of tired farm workers returning home rather than fugitives making an escape. They had covered perhaps half the distance to the ford when Werner detected movement ahead, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper darkness of a tree line. He kept walking, giving the slightest hand signal to his companions to indicate potential danger while maintaining their pace and posture. "Evening, gentlemen," a voice called in French as they drew nearer. A German patrol. 2 soldiers and a sergeant, their uniforms visible now in the fading light. Evening, Werner replied in the local accent he had practiced, touching his cap respectfully without fully raising his face. Long day in the fields. Heading home now. The sergeant stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. Your papers, please. Werner produced the identity card Elise had provided, a convincing forgery created by the resistance network. My cousins have left theirs at home, he explained, with a mixture of apology and irritation. Jean is always forgetting his. Their farm is just beyond the ford if you wish to accompany us. The sergeant examined Werner's papers carefully before returning them. His gaze lingered on Cohen and Wilson, who maintained their practiced poses of tired disinterest. There is increased security in the region, the sergeant informed them. Curfew begins at 2000 hours starting tonight. You should hurry if you want to reach home before then. Yes, sir, thank you for the warning, Werner replied, again touching his cap respectfully. The patrol moved on, continuing along the path toward the village. Werner maintained their steady pace until the Germans were well out of sight before allowing himself a small sigh of relief. That was too close, Wilson whispered. No, that was exactly as close as it needed to be, Werner corrected him. If we had tried to hide or change our route, it would have aroused suspicion. Encounters like that are normal in occupied territory. Avoiding them is what draws attention. They reached Laval's farm without further incident, approaching cautiously from the eastern field as planned. Monsieur Laval, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s, with a face weathered by decades of outdoor work, met them at the barn door and quickly ushered them inside. The barn had been converted into an impromptu medical facility. Sergeant Reynolds lay on a clean pallet, his leg properly splinted and bandaged, his fever apparently reduced by the antibiotics they had managed to obtain. Lieutenant Parker sat nearby, engaged in conversation with Elise and another man Werner didn't recognize. This is Marcel, Elise introduced the stranger. A thin man with alert eyes and the careful movements of someone accustomed to dangerous work. He is our contact with the escape network. Marcel nodded briskly. The radio is prepared. If your frequencies and codes are accurate, we may be able to coordinate an extraction by air rather than attempting the longer route to Spain. Werner spent the next hour working with the resistance radio operator, a young woman introduced only as Sophie, programming the German frequencies into their equipment and explaining the authentication protocols and schedule rotations. The Germans changed codes on a regular basis, but Werner's intimate knowledge of the system allowed them to predict the likely variations. We need to create a diversion, Marcel explained, as they gathered around a rough map of the region spread on Laval's kitchen table. Something significant enough to draw security forces away from our extraction zone, but not so destructive as to trigger reprisals against civilians. False information is better than explosives, Werner suggested. If we can transmit orders appearing to come from regional headquarters, redirecting patrols to respond to a non-existent security threat. Can you mimic the proper authentication codes and speaking patterns? Sophie asked skeptically. Werner nodded. I monitored these communications daily for months. More importantly, I know which officers are on duty at specific hours and can imitate their speech patterns and command styles. The plan took shape. Using the resistance transmitter, they would send false orders redirecting security patrols to investigate reports of parachute drops near a forest 10 kilometers south of their actual extraction zone. Meanwhile, the remaining Americans would be moved to Laval's farm in small groups throughout the following day, assembling for a nighttime pickup by an Allied aircraft that would land briefly in the large eastern field if Marcel could successfully make contact with London. As the others refined details, Werner found himself drawn into conversation with Cohen, who had been watching him with undisguised interest throughout the planning session. You're putting yourself at considerable risk, the American observed. If captured, you'd face execution for treason, rather than simply being returned to duty or sent to a prisoner of war camp. Werner acknowledged this with a slight shrug. I crossed that bridge when I deserted. The direction I travel now makes little difference to the consequences if I'm caught. Cohen seemed unsatisfied with this answer. But why help us specifically? You could have continued with your original escape plan once you discovered we were hiding in the basement. Werner considered the question carefully before responding. When I was a student, before the war, I studied engineering. We learned that the true measure of a structure is not how it performs under normal conditions, but how it responds to unexpected stress. Perhaps it is the same with people. I did not know who I truly was until faced with choices I never expected to make. Cohen nodded slowly. My father said something similar once. He left Germany in 1933, said he could see what was coming and couldn't be part of it. I wondered sometimes if he was being dramatic. He paused. I don't wonder anymore. The moment of understanding between them was interrupted by Marcel, who approached with news that contact had been established with London. An extraction aircraft, a modified British Lysander capable of short takeoffs and landings, would attempt retrieval the following night if weather conditions permitted. We have 24 hours to move the remaining men and prepare the landing field, he announced. Werner, you will need to transmit the false orders approximately 2 hours before the scheduled landing time. The next day unfolded in a carefully orchestrated sequence of movements. Werner returned to the cottage alone at dawn to help the remaining Americans prepare for transport. Throughout the day, they departed in pairs at staggered intervals, taking different routes to Laval's farm. By late afternoon, the basement was empty, and Werner performed a thorough cleaning to remove all evidence of its recent occupants. As he worked, he found himself reflecting on the strange twist of fate that had brought him to this moment. 1 week earlier, he had been Corporal Kleinschmidt, a disillusioned but obedient soldier in the German army. Now he was Pierre Beaumont, French farmer, resistance collaborator, and husband to a woman whose courage continued to astonish him. Elise returned as evening approached, carrying a basket of vegetables from the market as if it were any normal day. The Germans have established checkpoints on the main roads, she reported, but the forest paths remain unguarded. We should leave within the hour if we want to reach the farm before curfew. Werner nodded, then hesitated. Elise, he began, unsure how to express the thoughts that had been forming in his mind. After this is finished, after the Americans are gone, what happens to us? To this marriage of convenience? She regarded him thoughtfully, her dark eyes revealing nothing of her own feelings on the matter. That depends on what you want, Werner. The resistance network can help you reach Switzerland if that is still your goal, or, he prompted when she didn't continue. Or you could stay, she said simply. The resistance always needs people with your skills, and Pierre Beaumont exists now on paper. He could continue to exist in reality. Before Werner could respond, a distant sound caught their attention. Vehicles on the approach road. Elise moved quickly to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. German trucks, she confirmed. At least 3. They're stopping at the edge of the village. Werner joined her at the window. The search authorization, he remembered. Captain Richter said they would return today. We need to leave. Now, Elise urged, already gathering the small pack she had prepared. They slipped out through the garden as they had the previous evening, but this time headed directly into the forest that bordered the eastern edge of the property. The dense trees provided cover as they moved swiftly away from the village, following a narrow game trail that wound through the underbrush. Behind them, they could hear voices calling in German as the search party spread through the village. Soon those voices faded as distance and forest absorbed the sounds. They maintained a steady pace, Elise leading with the confidence of someone who had traveled these hidden paths many times before. They reached Laval's farm as twilight deepened into night. The Americans were gathered in the barn, their aircraft expected within the hour, if all went according to plan. Werner immediately went to the small room where the radio equipment was set up, preparing to transmit the false orders that would draw German patrols away from the landing area. Sophie, the resistance radio operator, handed him the microphone. The frequency is set. Authentication codes are ready. Werner took a deep breath, mentally rehearsing the voice and manner of Captain Richter, whose authority would not be questioned by patrol leaders. When he began to speak into the microphone, his German was crisp and commanding, the words flowing with practiced military precision as he directed patrols to investigate reported parachute drops near St. Clement, far from their actual position. When he finished the transmission, The room was silent for a moment before Marcel spoke. "That was remarkable," the resistance leader said quietly. "If I had not known it was you speaking, I would have sworn it was a German officer." "It was a German officer," Werner replied with a hint of sadness, "just not the one they thought." The next hour passed in tense preparation. The Americans were briefed on the extraction procedure, how to approach the aircraft, the order of boarding, the need for absolute silence throughout the operation. The landing field was prepared with the minimum required lighting, small covered lamps that would be visible from the air but not from the nearby road. At precisely 2300 hours, they heard it, the muffled drone of an aircraft flying unusually low, approaching from the west with its lights extinguished. Marcel signaled to his team, who uncovered the field lamps in the predetermined pattern. The aircraft, a sleek black shape against the starry sky, made one pass over the field before circling back to land. The Lysander touched down with remarkable precision, rolling to a stop near the edge of the field where the Americans waited. Its engine continued to run, propeller spinning, as the pilot gestured urgently for the passengers to board. Werner stood with Elise and the resistance members, watching as Captain Miller organized his men for rapid boarding. Sergeant Reynolds was carried aboard first, his condition improved but still serious. The others followed quickly, ducking into the cramped fuselage designed to extract agents and downed airmen from occupied territory. Lieutenant Cohen was the last to board. He paused at the aircraft door, turning back to locate Werner in the darkness. When their eyes met, the American offered a salute, a gesture of respect from one soldier to another, transcending the uniforms they had once worn on opposite sides. Werner returned the salute, feeling an unexpected sense of completion in the exchange. The aircraft began to move almost before Cohen had pulled the door closed, accelerating rapidly across the darkened field. Within moments it was airborne, climbing steeply into the night sky and banking westward toward England. Werner watched until the sound of its engines faded completely, leaving only the nocturnal chorus of insects and the soft sighing of wind through the trees. "It is done," Marcel said, already organizing his people to remove all evidence of the operation. "You have both taken enormous risks. The network is grateful." Werner barely heard him, his attention focused on Elise, who stood slightly apart from the group, her face tilted toward the stars. He moved to join her, standing close enough to speak privately, but not touching. "They made it," he said softly. 10 more, who will see home again." Elise nodded, her expression thoughtful in the dim light. "And now you must decide about your own path home." Werner considered his options, though in truth, he had already made his decision during those tense hours in the basement with the American airmen. "I think Pierre Beaumont might have useful skills to contribute to your resistance network," he said carefully, "if his wife approves." A smile touched the corners of Elise's mouth. "His wife thinks they should discuss the matter properly, perhaps over breakfast tomorrow in their cottage, once the German search parties have found nothing and moved on to the next village. A breakfast conversation between husband and wife," Werner mused. "How ordinary that sounds." "Ordinary is what we fight for," Elise replied, her hand finding his in the darkness. "The right to live ordinary lives in peace." As they walked back toward the farmhouse, where they would spend the night before returning to the village, Werner reflected on the strange journey that had brought him here. He had deserted the German army, seeking escape from a conflict he no longer believed in, only to find himself more deeply engaged in it than ever before, but now on terms he could reconcile with his conscience. The marriage certificate bearing the names of Pierre and Elise Beaumont had been created as a deception, a practical solution to an immediate problem, yet something genuine had begun to take root within that fabrication, a partnership forged in danger and mutual respect that might, given time and peace, blossom into something neither of them had anticipated when they first met as fugitive and reluctant protector. The war would continue for months to come, its massive machinery grinding across continents regardless of individual choices or personal revelations. But in this small corner of occupied France, 10 American airmen were flying home to safety, and a German deserter had found not just shelter, but purpose, not just a hiding place, but a possible future. Captain Miller would later report in his debriefing that the resistance network in the Loire Valley region had been instrumental in the rescue of his crew, specifically mentioning the courage of a French widow and her husband, a former German soldier, whose technical knowledge had proven decisive in coordinating their extraction. This report would eventually make its way into classified Allied records, one small note in the vast documentation of World War II. In the village of Saint-Laurent, the Germans would continue their searches for several days before moving their focus elsewhere, never discovering that the quarry they sought had not only evaded them, but had actively worked against them from within the very community they controlled. The cottage at the edge of the village would remain under occasional surveillance, but the unremarkable couple who lived there, the widow Beaumont and her new husband from Alsace, would attract less attention as time passed, and on quiet evenings, when the work of the day was done, Werner and Elise would sometimes sit together by the fire, speaking in low voices of what might come after the war, of studies resumed, of teaching positions, of a cottage rebuilt and expanded, of children who might someday play in the garden where American airmen had once crept through the darkness toward freedom. These were ordinary dreams, remarkable only in that they dared to imagine a future beyond the all-consuming present of war. And in nurturing such dreams, in continuing to plan and hope despite the uncertain days ahead, they engaged in perhaps the most profound act of resistance possible, the refusal to surrender the human capacity for looking forward, for believing in the possibility of peace and renewal, even in the darkest of times. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.